Another year, another set of problems that all look suspiciously much like nails to those who wish to apply a hammer to every problem. The hungry hammer, to be specific. Because, as we see again and again in the mainstream gaming media and related publications, unionization is the answer. To what, you may ask? Well, to overtime, to sexism, to discrimination, to racism, and everything in between. In fact, it appears to nearly always be the only answer. Even, ironically, in situations like with Activision Blizzard, where the Californian state and many other state and federal agencies have already taken actions against the problem. Oh, look, they cry, governmental agencies are working as intended, for once, and are trying to enforce the laws protecting us against the things we complain about. Clearly, we need a union. But why? Well, to protect us against the things that are already illegal, of course. So, let's talk about unions, shall we, in the video game industry. Now, certainly, misunderstand me correctly, no governmental agency is ever perfect. Least of all in the US. But if a thing like sexual harassment is already illegal, then what precisely can a union do that the police or a lawsuit cannot? This is usually the point at which the pro-union people tend to shut up, as in reality, legally speaking, unions have dick all power in this regard. Take, for example, the actual measures being taken to protect employees, like Title VII of the Federal Civil Rights Act. Its intention is to make it illegal for employers to make hiring, firing, or promotion decisions based on, quote, an employee's willingness to respond to a supervisor's sexual advances, end quote. In layman's terms, the intent is obvious. It means that an employer can't take any sort of punitive action against you because you tell them to go screw themselves. And unsurprisingly, a union has no federal legal power, nor any state legal power either. So what can a union do at all in regards to sexual harassment? Well, in the best case scenario, they can point you towards the aforementioned state or federal laws and tell you to apply those. Or, alternatively, they will do what unions do best. Namely, protecting those with seniority. The supervisor doing the harassment. Because, surprise, surprise, there is no magical dividing line separating union members from sexual harassers. And so a union can quickly, and often do, find itself in the paradoxical position of representing both the accused and the accuser at the same time. I'm sure that you can see the proverbial communist fly in the ointment with that situation. In fact, it is such an obvious problem that in many cases, unions simply don't take on sexual harassment complaints. Because there's nothing they can do. And if they do insist on getting involved, then what happens? Again, the union has no actual power. And if there is a conflict of interest, they will probably have to launch numerous internal investigations, eating up time you could have used to get a real lawyer to push your actual legal rights, rather than waiting around for the union to figure out what they might be. As even in the best case scenario, they will really just point you towards a lawyer who will say, well, you've wasted a lot of time on stupid shit, but now that you're finally here, let's get started. Now, of course, there are some potential benefits like paying less or not paying the lawyer at all if it is a union representative, but if you are in a case where you are accusing another union member, how much are you going to trust the union-appointed lawyer going up against the other union-appointed lawyer? So, no, unions are not going to fix sexual harassment complaints, unless you mean perhaps getting the sexual harassers rehired and compensated for wrongful termination. You know, maybe the Hungry Hammer does have some uses. Even a broken clock and all that, after all. But what about the other big problem? The bigger problem, I would argue. Even if unions can do naught but add yet more fuel to the Me Too fire, then maybe they can crack the crunch nut. Unlikely, though, to be fair, in this case there is an argument to be made. For you see, I am not against the idea of a union. Indeed, they have done much good in the Western world, and many of the labour protection laws we enjoy today are as a result of union activity. Stuff like mandatory vacation time, paid overtime, medical leave, etc., etc. But you will note that these are by and large generally held privileges protected by, as mentioned, law, as it was not the unions that created these benefits, it was the state. It could easily and correctly be stated that the best actions of the union is simply to bring light to an issue so that the state, the government, or whatever regulatory entity is put in place to deal with this can take the appropriate action. And generally, when action is taken, the union becomes somewhat worthless, often dying off or clinging to life by collecting membership fees in the same way that a couch potato might pay his local gym to keep his membership card in an exceedingly dusty box somewhere. Or, as is in the case with Norway, by mooching off the state. LO is a socialist organization. Straight up, they call themselves a socialist organization. And it is essentially another arm of the Norwegian Workers' Party. It has almost 1 million members, from which the union takes a percentage cut of their earnings, and this cut can be subtracted from the employees' taxes. Meaning that in all due essentiality, it is the Norwegian state that takes the bill and indirectly pays for the upkeep of the union. One of the many, many reasons I quite truly hate doing my taxes, as I personally believe the only suitable place for LO in particular is the deep fry section of hell. But hey, tails. Back to the question of crunch. Over here in the civilized Norwegian world, the max work week is 40 hours, with some provisions for overtime on top of that. Like no more than 10 extra hours per week, or no more than 25 extra hours over the course of 4 weeks. Reasonable enough. It establishes a ceiling and tosses on a little window at the top for businesses that really do need that little extra help to finish important projects. In the US as well, there is actually similar legislation mandating maximum work weeks of 44 hours, but there is copious quantities of fine print. And each state has their own bucket load of fine print to add onto that. Additional rules and qualifications and magical wizardry. There was even, mind you, a time when the rules got so confused that a lot of companies simply heaped on arbitrary hours and overtime against the regulations until finally a bunch of EA employees, of all people, were quite successful in suing and forcing companies to abide by the regulations and also deliver sizable settlements as well. And then Arnold Schwarzenegger decided to put the screws to the industry. California is, as it turns out, a hellhole, and due to rules and laws put in place by the Terminator, it is a lot easier for gaming studios to get away with insane overtime. Why? Because gaming employees earn too much money, and so they were not covered by the regular hour labor laws. So, Let us play commie advocate for a moment here. What could a union do to fix this? Because it is a problem. It would have to make the companies themselves make promises and institute their own internal regulations. Again, they could lobby the government and the state, but since California gets all of their money from the gaming industry and has already taken repeated actions to make crunch legal, that's unlikely. You could try to go federal, but that's a whole other heaping bucket of fish. Fortunately, the problem in the gaming industry also presents a solution. Gaming companies have for a long time combined the art of poor project planning with wildly optimistic interpretations of their own abilities. This is nothing new and leads to a great deal of repeated ridiculous delays. But back in yonder years, when developers made games almost purely out of passion rather than as any really sustainable business, they kind of just kept working because it was their baby. But these days, when it is a massive industry and a simple, good old regular ass job for many, work weeks stretching into 60, 70, 80, or even 100 hours per week, that's gonna get gnarly real fast. Or slow, I guess, depending upon your interpretation. And hey, no matter how passionate you may be, 100-hour work week is doubtlessly draining. But on the bright side, the tottering Tower of Babel that is a modern games timetable supplies ample opportunity for wrenchers to be inserted into the cogs and the wheel works, as a workers' strike may potentially force the company to comply with the demands of set working hours or overtime pay or what have you. Tragically, though, the reality once more pisses in the eyes of hope. Because for all of the tragic corporatization of the industry, it is still a career that attracts a lot of passionate people who want to make games and to work at the cool-ass companies they loved whilst growing up. Meaning that there are a lot of candidates willing to work those ridiculous hours just to work at Blizzard. Especially for the pay, considering that good old Bobby Kotick's minimum permissible pay in California was some $60,000 plus. You can imagine. In fact, according to some of the estimates I found, the average was hovering around $80,000 a year. I know a lot of people that would work insane hours for that kind of pay. And the pay, too, again, is a problem. The core of a union is communal bargaining power. As a large number of people all negotiating as one should, in theory, have more leverage. But in return, it also means that you are bound by the lowest common denominator. The least skilled programmer will drag down the salary of the highest skilled programmer, who might otherwise have been able to negotiate a much better pay. And when we're talking about $80K a year, a 5% salary increase instead of a 2%, that's a pretty big deal. But even if it could be done, assuming a large enough portion of the employees wish to give away their individual power and haggle as a horde, and assuming the company is willing to go along, we still have the Achilles heels of unions, namely the cost. A recent example was shown with Paizo. The creators of the D&D competitor Pathfinder was relying on huge numbers of freelance workers and were also underpaying their staff alongside it. And the reason they had to do this was because, according to former Paizo employees, no one wanted to pay what the product actually cost to make. Now, that's a whole other bucket of penis leeches in and of itself, but to make matters more interesting, the employees then decided that since the company isn't profitable, they wanted to be paid more and work less. Oh, and also to prevent the company from firing anyone to cut costs. Paizo, not wanting to go bankrupt, refused to recognize the small union, and this caused their freelancers to all gather together, probably prodded by the union, and began to withhold active and finished work, along with refusing further jobs for Paizo, putting the company in a stranglehold of having no way to actually produce the product and no way to get paid. That turned out to quite traumatize the upper management, it did, and unsurprisingly so. A bit later on, one single, solitary, anonymous letter from a supposed freelancer led Paizo to announce, fearfully, that they would remove and ban all mentions and references to slavery in their game and world. I did a whole video on this a while ago. Eventually, however, realizing that they had pissed themselves in paranoid fright over a mouse fart, the producer responsible for the previous statement, Erica Mona, jumped in her little rowboat and rowed it back later on with a nice and confusing statement, leaving everyone equally puzzled and bamboozled as to what the hell Paizo was actually doing. But early onset brain rot is a common signifier of unionization, so we shouldn't be super surprised. And whilst the big boy companies, the Activisions and the Rockstars of the gaming world could probably afford it, widespread unionization of the smaller or mid-sized companies like Paizo will sure as sunburn lead to their explosive and messy death. And this is before we get into the problem that even the best and brightest and biggest of these unions only attract a tiny percentile of the overall workers, in large part because the unions tend to also be very clearly and overtly political. Most of these unions are not being organized out of actual genuine concern for the working conditions, but instead, like with Activision Blizzard, are being organized primarily as a way to try and seize more power over the company. So no, unions will not fix the, admittedly in many cases, severe problems with the gaming industry, because these problems are a lot larger than the gaming industry, and particularly the unions that are being suggested now by overwhelmingly activists will not fix the issues, but will rather introduce a whole host of brand new issues, and will probably kill a lot of companies before it is brought back under control yet again. On the sunny side, however, I imagine a lot of CEOs and higher-up executives seeing this begin to happen, and beginning to affect their piggy bank, might reconsider hiring obvious and self-defining activists in the future. We'll see. Burnt children fear fire and all that. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and if you liked the video, please do consider leaving a comment, a like, and maybe even subscribing. Who knows? You might actually be given notifications about future videos. Living on in ever more strident optimism. Have a good day.